Today I would like to talk to you about a little bit of wizardry, some magic, amazing tricks, and all focused on wonderful, miraculous wands. Intuitively, we all enjoy these kind of mythical stories, especially in our generation when wonderful series and movies such as Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter became so popular. And yes, indeed, we all have in our minds the images of Gandalf, the white wizard with his wonderful, powerful white rod, and perhaps Harry Potter with his amazing wand and his great battle against Dumbledore. Yes, magical wands. We all, of course, are aware of the fact that in Judaism, witchcraft is punishable by death. In fact, the Torah disdained from any sign of wizardry and magic. Magicians, we're not talking about sleight of hand, but those that proclaim to actually have magical powers, are deemed to be punished by death. We disdain from any such phenomena. We reject it categorically. It is strictly prohibited. It is considered to be elements of idolatry. Our entire fight against idolatry in the world, both historically and contemporary, relates to the notion that the true unnatural powers in this world all belong in the hands of God. Humanity is restricted to function within the boundaries of nature, and that's the way we're supposed to behave. Any belief in something outside of that can be interpreted as idolatry. It is interesting that when the young Jewish nation comes into being, when we are starting to emerge out of the centuries of slavery in Egypt, Moshe is sent on the awesome task of delivering the Israelites from Egypt, not just by delivering the people physically out of Egypt, but by actually pulling the Jewish people out of the depth of the idolatry of Egypt to the heights that will be required to climb up Mount Sinai to become a nation that is worthy of being the receptacle of the Torah, to the moment where they could stand by Har Sinai and receive the 10 Commandments. In fact, when Moshe first confronts God at the burning bush, challenging God's orders that he should go save the Jewish people, when he is appointed as the Redeemer, he says to God, "Why? Why send me? Why can't you send anyone else? In fact, what do you need me at all for?" God answers him in the most peculiar way. God says to him, "Here is a sign for you that I sent you. When you come out of Egypt, you will worship me on this mountain." I remember reading this sentence for the first time, saying to myself, this sounds similar to the way my father acted anytime I asked him why I have to do something that I really didn't want to do. And his answer was almost always the same. "First do what I tell you, then come back to me and I'll explain to you why. Don't ask me why, do what I say." Similarly, Moshe asked, "Why are you sending me?" And he's answered, "Well, when you come back, you will worship me on this mountain, and that's the sign that I was right." What do you mean? How does it help me to know what I'll do after the mission's done? I'm telling you right now that I don't think that I should do this mission in the first place. Indeed, God is not saying that to him at all. God is saying to him, this is your mission. You see, Moshe, you're right. If my objective was to get the Jews out of Egypt, piece of cake. I'm God. You know, fold my arms, wiggle my nose, do whatever it takes, boom, clap my hands, Israelites are out. I want to punish the Egyptians, boom, one big plague, all Egyptians dead, Israelites free to go. What's the problem? There isn't a limit on divine power. And yet, says God to Moshe, that's not your mission at all. You see, your mission, Moshe, is going to be to get the Israelites out of Egypt, not physically. You have to get the Israelites spiritually out of Egypt. And that is a huge, awesome, almost impossible task. Indeed, Moshe starts his journey. But before he could leave, when he asks God for some signs that he could show the people of Israel when he first introduces himself to them, God says to him, "What is that in your hand?" And Moshe says, "A staff, a mateh." He says to him, "Throw it on the ground." He throws it on the ground and it turns into a snake. And Moshe gets scared and runs away from it. God says to him, "Don't run away, grab it by its tail." Yeah, that's what I would like to do. Moshe fearfully approaches it, grabs it by a tail, and it turns back to a stick into his hand. Most of us have in our minds the image that happens later on, the first time Moshe appears in front of Paro, when he stands in front of the Pharaoh and his entire court, and he throws the same stick down on the ground, it turns into a serpent, and immediately all of Paro's magicians throw their magical wands on the ground and turn them into snakes as well. And then, with a powerful show of force, Moshe's staff, this mateh, gobbles up all of the other serpents and returns to Moshe's hand. This mateh, which Moshe is told to use to perform these miracles, seems to play a pivotal role in almost every single one of the plagues. Each time with a little bit of nuance of formulation or nuance of change, if it's with Moshe's staff in his hand, staff without his hand, hand with his staff, but basically the staff is always there. It is there all the way through the storyline when Moshe is standing in front of the sea, when the people are pinned against the ocean and Paro's army is fastly encroaching, and Moshe needs to split the sea in order for them to pass. It is there, at the end of Moshe's career, when God sends him to talk to the stone and bring out water for the young people to drink. And Moshe, in a moment of anger, in a moment of impatience, strikes the stone with his rod twice and makes the water come out. And by that action, loses his right to lead the people and finishes his career. I wondered often why God even wanted such a rod, such a magical staff to be in use. If the purpose of the journey, if the purpose of Moshe's mission is to liberate the young Israelite people from the depth of the Egyptian idolatry, why introduce a magical wand? Why introduce an object that would be perceived as another source of idolatry? In fact, the Midrash tells us that this mateh was in function up until the splitting of the sea. And there, in an analysis of the nuance of the text, where God tells Moshe, lift the rod, and then raise your hand and split the sea with your hand. To that says the Midrash, Moshe, says God, no longer do I want this magical wand to be used. Lift the staff and remove it so all the people could see that it is not the staff that is splitting the sea. But rather, I want you to split the sea with your own very hands. Split the sea by yourself. And indeed, the next phrase in the Torah is, Vaya'aminu b'Hashem uveMoshe avdo. The people believed in God and believed in Moshe, his servant. So what is it that they believed in? Did they believe that the magical powers of the wand transferred into Moshe himself? That Moshe now became the magical instrument of God? Did they believe perhaps that Moshe possessed his own intrinsic power And thus Moshe himself could be an object of worship, of idolatry. We indeed see that when Moshe disappears on the mountain and does not come down after 40 days, the people move into panic, not quite sure. You see, after the splitting of the sea, the staff was not supposed to be used anymore. But this young nation, struggling to break free of centuries of idolatry and slavery, have a great deal of difficulty adjusting to life in the desert. Before they even get to Mount Sinai, the Torah tells us, they wander for 3 days in the desert and they get thirsty. And they cry out to Moshe, we need water. We need to be taken care of. God, realizing the weakness of the people, tells Moshe, take the staff that you used to strike the Nile and go to the stone and strike it. Yes, this is the first time Moshe meets the stone, and this time he is told to strike the stone and give water to this young people. Why use the phrase, take the staff that you have struck the Nile with? After all, so many plagues have been done since then. This staff has become the symbol of Moshe's power in the eyes of the Egyptian and in the eyes of the Israelites. Perhaps God is saying to Moshe something very different. Perhaps God is saying to Moshe, Moshe, pay attention. You think your mission is done? You think now that they are free from the clutches of Egypt, you have finished your job? No, Moshe, your job first begins. You have first started a very long and laborious task of rising these people, of bringing them up from the depth of idolatry to heights in which they could believe in God as the only God, creator of the world, and accept Torah and law. That mission is still far ahead of you. Pay attention, Moshe. In so many ways, these people are still in ground zero. They're still all the way back in day one when you introduced yourself to them, when you struck the Nile River. They have not yet climbed spiritually to where you think they are. You need to work on them. You need to help them grow. And this weakness of the people is reflected by the next story in Torah. Well, we hear about the aggressive nation of Amalek, the Amalekites that come to attack us. And Moshe calls his disciple Yehoshua and says to him, Yehoshua, go grab 12,000 people and go out to launch war against Amalek. Tomorrow I'm going to climb up to this mountain, and I'm going to stand on top of the mountain with God's staff in my hand. And you will see me on the mountain with the staff, and that will give you the power to win the war. So Moshe thought that the people have become completely dependent upon the rod. You see, Moshe finally understood the function of the rod was to allow the people to believe. A nation that was born and bred into idolatry, that all they knew were the idols of Egypt, could not possibly understand what it means to have a singular God that cannot be seen, that cannot be heard, that cannot be felt, that cannot be touched, that has no physical representation in this world. He understood they needed something to hold on to. And for them, indeed, the staff becomes a conduit. The conduit by which this divine power, this God of theirs, is expressing himself in this world. They needed the rod to help them slowly edge away from idolatry, to slowly become to the point in which they could understand and believe, Vayaminu b'Hashem, uva Moshe avdo. They achieved this at the splitting of the sea, but couldn't hold on to it. The great challenge of the desert made it too difficult. And thus, when the Amalekites strike and the people have to go out to war, Moshe thinks they're going to need this staff in order to become victorious. How mistaken he was again. You see, God understood the hearts of the people and knew that they were ready for the next stage in their development. Moshe goes up to the mountain, and the Torah tells us that his hands became weak and tired. He was so tired that he couldn't even keep his own hands up. And he needed Aaron and his nephew Hur to prop up his hands and hold him up. And it is hands that were held up throughout the whole war. And the Mishnah tells us that any time Moshe's hands weakened and lowered, the Israelites started losing. And the minute his hands stood tall and strong, they were victorious. Asks the Mishnah, what? Are the hands of Moshe creating war or defeating war? Do we want to believe that now the people believed in Moshe's powers? Answers the Mishnah, no, not at all. You see, the hands of Moshe were a representation. They were a symbol to them. That all you really need to do is tone your heart to the right frequency. You see, if you turn the dial to the right frequency and understand that you have the ability to communicate directly with God, that you could feel the relationship with God all by yourself, if you really felt that belief in God at that moment, you will become victorious. And thus, every time Moshe's hands stood tall, they remembered their relationship with God and were able to win the battle. Curiously, that is the last time the Matta is mentioned. This staff disappears. It disappears for 40 years. For 40 years it is not mentioned and it is not used. We know this by a very small nuance. You see, 40 years later, when the new generation that was brought up in the desert was ready to enter the land, but they lost Aaron, they lost Miriam. Their kind leaders were now dead, and they felt alone only with Moshe. And Moshe, as a leader, as a giant of a leader that he was somewhat distant and aloof from the people. And they cry out for water because they're thirsty, not just physical thirst. They were spiritually thirsty. They needed to be fed. And God tells Moshe, take the rod, milifnei ha'elohim. Take it from in front of me, which means the rod all this time was in the tent. And later in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, sitting there. He says to Moshe, take this staff. Take it to the stone and show them like you did by the splitting of the sea. You do not need this staff. You don't need an intermediator. You don't even need me. All you really need to do is use your lips. If you want God to grant you water, if you're thirsty for God, then pray. Just talk. God hears you. Turn your heart to the right frequency and talk, and the water will come flowing. Yet Moshe, at a moment of anger, didn't see this young nation. He didn't connect properly. And he saw in his eyes the same pestilent nation that came out of Egypt. In a moment of anger, he strikes the stone, and by thus he catapults the people 40 years backwards in their theological development. And they need to climb all the way up again. Immediately after, the Torah tells us of the story of the serpents that came to bite the people. And God is telling Moshe, go create a serpent out of copper and put it on a pole so the people could look up to the serpent and they will be saved. And the Mishnah asks the same question. Does a serpent bring life? Does a serpent bring death? Isn't this another form of idolatry? Immediately says the Mishnah, no, the people understood. The serpent on the pole merely represented their need to call out to God. It reminded them that if you want to be saved from serpents in your life, if you want to be saved from the troubles that ill you, turn your heart to the right frequency and open your heart in prayer. Talk to God. He hears you. Talk to him and you will be saved. See, we don't need magical wands. We don't need powerful staffs. The powerful wand, the powerful magic that we hold is in our hearts and in our mouth. All we need to do is learn to use them because God is always listening. Thank you all very much for listening.